Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives Deep Dive series, where we explore in depth the rich and fascinating histories and geographies of every country on Earth. Tonight's episode brings us to Algeria, the largest nation in Africa. Stretching from the Mediterranean coastline to the vast sands of the Sahara Desert, Algeria's landscapes are as diverse as they are breathtaking, shaping its history and identity across thousands of years. In this episode, we'll take a calm, steady journey through the geography, history, and cultural spirit of Algeria. From the bustling streets of Algiers to the ancient Roman ruins of Timgad, from the Berber traditions rooted in the mountains to the resilience of desert communities, this is a story of endurance, cultural fusion, and transformation. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where and what time you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see how far this community reaches around the world. And if you're enjoying this series, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future deep dives. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of Algeria. Chapter 1: The Land Between Worlds. Picture yourself standing on the Mediterranean coast of North Africa, where the azure waters meet golden beaches that stretch as far as the eye can see. Behind you, rolling hills rise toward distant mountains, their peaks catching the morning light. This is Algeria, a land that has served as a bridge between worlds for millennia, where Africa meets Europe, where the Mediterranean kisses the Sahara, where ancient Berber traditions interweave with Arab heritage and colonial memories. Algeria is vast beyond imagination. At 2.38 million square kilometers, it claims the distinction of being Africa's largest country, larger than Mexico, Iran, and Libya combined. To truly grasp its scale, imagine that you could fit the United Kingdom into Algeria nearly 10 times over, with room to spare. This immensity shapes everything about the Algerian experience, its diverse landscapes, its scattered populations, and the challenges of unity across such geographic breadth. The country's very name whispers of its maritime character. Algezer, meaning the islands in Arabic, refers to the rocky islands that dot the coastline near the capital city of Algiers. These small Mediterranean outcrops, now mostly connected to the mainland, once served as natural harbours for Phoenician traders, Roman galleys, and later the ships of Ottoman corsairs. The name captures something essential about Algeria's relationship with the sea, not just as a boundary, but as a gateway to the wider world. Algeria's geography unfolds in distinct bands, like geological chapters in an ancient book. The northernmost region, known as the Tell, embraces the entire 200-kilometer Mediterranean coastline. Here, in this narrow, fertile strip that rarely extends more than 100 kilometers inland, lives over 90% of Algeria's population. The Tell is a land of olive groves and wheat fields, of coastal cities where the scent of jasmine mingles with salt air, where the pace of life has been shaped by both the rhythms of agriculture and the ebb and flow of Mediterranean commerce. The Tell itself is not uniform. Moving eastward from the Moroccan border, the landscape shifts from the coastal plains near Oran to the rugged beauty of the Kabylie Mountains, home to the Berber peoples who have maintained their distinct identity through centuries of change. The Grande Kabylie, with its dramatic peaks and deep valleys, has long been a stronghold of Amazigh culture, where ancient languages echo off mountain walls and traditional ways of life persist alongside modernity. South of the Tell rise the Atlas Mountains, that magnificent spine of North Africa that extends from Morocco through Algeria and into Tunisia. In Algeria, these mountains divide into two primary chains, the Tell Atlas nearer the coast and the Saharan Atlas further south. Between them lies a high plateau region, an elevated tableland where temperatures swing dramatically between scorching summer days and surprisingly cold winter nights. The Tel Atlas, with its highest peak at Lala Khadija reaching 308 meters, creates a natural barrier that influences everything from rainfall patterns to cultural exchanges. These mountains capture moisture from Mediterranean winds, creating pockets of surprising greenery in an otherwise arid landscape. Ancient caravan routes wound through mountain passes here, connecting the coastal cities with the interior, carrying not just goods but ideas, languages, and beliefs. Beyond the mountains stretches the high plateaus, a region of stark beauty where the African landscape begins its transition toward the Sahara. This is a land of scattered oases, seasonal lakes that shimmer like mirages, and vast stretches where the horizon seems to extend into infinity. The plateaus average between 901–200 meters in elevation, creating a unique climate that is neither fully Mediterranean nor fully Saharan. Then comes the Sahara itself, that legendary desert that covers more than 80% of Algeria's territory. The Algerian Sahara is not the uniform sea of sand that popular imagination might suggest, but rather a complex landscape of rocky plateaus, scattered mountain ranges, salt flats, and yes, the great sand seas called ergs that can stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Here, in the Tassili Najer and Hoga massifs, ancient rock art tells stories of when this region was green and full of life, when elephants and giraffes roamed where now only the hardy Tuareg peoples traverse with their camel caravans. The climate tells its own story of geographic diversity. Along the coast, the Mediterranean climate brings mild, wet winters and warm, dry summers, a pattern familiar to anyone who has experienced the shores of Spain or Greece. But move inland, and the story changes rapidly. The mountains create their own weather systems, with snow not uncommon on the higher peaks in winter. The high plateaus experience a continental climate of extremes, while the Sahara presents one of Earth's most challenging environments, where daytime temperatures can soar above 50 degrees Celsius, only to plummet near freezing on clear winter nights. Algeria's rivers reflect this geographic complexity. Unlike the great rivers of other African nations, Algeria's waterways are mostly seasonal, filling with snowmelt and rain during winter months, then dwindling to mere trickles or dry beds during the summer. The Chelif, the country's longest river, flows for 725 kilometers from the Tel Atlas to the Mediterranean. But even this substantial waterway can become a series of pools during dry years. Water has always been precious here, shaping settlement patterns and human activities in fundamental ways. The ancient peoples who lived in this land understood water's value, building sophisticated irrigation systems, carefully tending oases, and developing social structures around the sharing of this most vital resource. The geographic reality of water scarcity influenced everything from architectural styles, with their emphasis on courtyards and shade, to religious practices and daily rhythms of life. The coastline itself is surprisingly varied for a land often associated with desert. Moving from west to east, the shoreline includes broad beaches, rocky promontories, natural harbors, and wetlands that serve as crucial stopping points for migratory birds traveling between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. Cape Bengut, Cape Carbon, and Cape Bougueroun are among the dramatic headlands that break up the coastal plain, creating microclimates and natural harbors that have been prized since ancient times. This geographic foundation, the interplay between coast and mountain, plateau and desert, fertility and aridity, has shaped every aspect of Algerian civilization. It determined where cities would rise, how cultures would develop, and how peoples would interact with each other and with the wider world. The geography created natural regions with distinct characters. The cosmopolitan coast open to Mediterranean influences, the mountain strongholds where traditional ways persisted, the plateau crossroads where cultures met and mingled, and the vast Sahara that connected Algeria to the trade networks and spiritual traditions of sub-Saharan Africa. Understanding Algeria's geography is understanding the stage upon which all of its human drama has played out. The merchants who built trading empires, the conquerors who sought to control trade routes, the colonial administrators who tried to remake the land in their own image, and the modern nation builders who sought to unite diverse regions into a single state, all had to contend with these same geographic realities. The mountains that protected the Berber peoples also isolated them from central authority. The coastal plains that welcomed trade also invited invasion. The Sahara that enriched Algeria with oil and gas also posed endless challenges for transportation and communication. As we prepare to journey through Algeria's long and complex history, we carry with us this understanding of place, how the land itself has been both stage and actor in the unfolding human story. From the Phoenicians who first established trading posts along this coast, to the modern Algerians who continue to negotiate between tradition and change, all have been shaped by this remarkable geographic inheritance. This land between worlds that continues to bridge Africa and Europe, the ancient and the modern, the settled and the nomadic ways of life. Chapter 2: Echoes of Ancient Civilizations. In the soft light of dawn, if you could walk through the Tassili-Niger Plateau in southeastern Algeria, you would find yourself surrounded by one of the world's most remarkable galleries of ancient art. Painted on rock faces and carved into stone, thousands of images stretch across this now arid landscape, telling the story of a time when the Sahara was green. Here, dating back perhaps 10 years, prehistoric artists depicted elephants and rhinoceros, crocodiles and hippopotamus, scenes of hunting and dancing, of cattle herding, and community life that speak of a radically different environment. These rock paintings offer our earliest glimpse into the human story of Algeria, revealing that this land has been home to sophisticated cultures for millennia. The artists who created these works lived during the African humid period, when what is now the Sahara enjoyed a climate more like modern-day Sudan. Rivers flowed where now there are only dry wadis, and grasslands supported vast herds of animals that sustained human communities across this green Sahara. As the climate gradually shifted toward aridity around 40 years ago, many of these Saharan peoples migrated northward toward the Mediterranean coast and the Atlas Mountains, joining with populations who had long inhabited the more temperate regions. These migrations helped shape the complex ethnic tapestry that would come to define North African civilization, bringing together diverse groups who would eventually be known collectively as Berbers, or in their own language, Amazigh, meaning free people. The Berber peoples who emerged as the dominant inhabitants of Algeria were never a single unified culture, but rather a constellation of tribes and confederations, each adapted to their particular corner of this diverse landscape. In the mountains of Kabylie, they developed terraced agriculture and strong village democracies. In the high plateaus, they perfected the art of nomadic pastoralism, moving their flocks between seasonal grazing grounds. In the Sahara, the ancestors of the modern Tuareg created one of history's most successful desert civilizations, mastering the arts of navigation, trade, and survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments. When Phoenician merchants first arrived on Algeria's coast around 1200 BCE, they encountered not primitive peoples, but sophisticated societies with their own technologies, trade networks, and political systems. The Phoenicians, master traders of the ancient Mediterranean, were drawn to Algeria's natural harbours and its position along African trade routes. They established trading posts at sites that would later become major cities: Icosium, which would grow into modern Algiers, and Hippo Regius, near present-day Annaba. These early settlements were not conquests in the modern sense, but rather commercial partnerships between Phoenician merchants and local Berber rulers. The Phoenicians brought Mediterranean goods, new technologies, and the alphabet that would eventually evolve into the script used for Berber languages. In return, they gained access to African products, ivory and gold from the south, agricultural produce from the fertile coastal plains, and perhaps most importantly, a knowledge of routes across the Sahara that connected the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa. The relationship between Phoenicians and Berbers was complex and multifaceted. Intermarriage was common, creating mixed communities where Mediterranean and African traditions blended. Some Berber leaders adopted Phoenician customs and even Phoenician gods, while maintaining their own cultural practices. This pattern of selective adaptation, of embracing useful foreign innovations while preserving core cultural identity, would become a recurring theme throughout Algerian history. When Carthage rose to dominate the western Mediterranean, Algeria's coast became part of a vast trading empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of Egypt. The Carthaginian period, from roughly 600 to 146 BCE, saw the establishment of more permanent settlements and the integration of Berber territories into broader Mediterranean economic systems. Berber cavalry became legendary throughout the ancient world, serving in Carthaginian armies that challenged Rome itself. The great Carthaginian general Hannibal relied heavily on Berber horsemen during his famous crossing of the Alps, their skill and mobility proving crucial in his early victories against Roman legions. Yet even as they served Carthaginian interests, the Berber peoples maintained their independence in the interior regions. The mountains and plateaus remained under local control, governed by traditional councils and ruled by chiefs who acknowledged Carthaginian authority along the coast while maintaining autonomy inland. This geographic division between coastal integration and interior independence would repeat itself through centuries of foreign rule. The Roman conquest of Carthage in 146 BCE marked the beginning of a new chapter in Algeria's story, though it took centuries for Roman control to extend beyond the immediate coastal regions. The Romans called the land Numidia, after the nomadic peoples they encountered there, and they found in the Berbers both fierce resistance and valuable allies. Some Berber kingdoms, recognizing Roman military superiority, chose accommodation and alliance. Others, particularly in the mountainous regions, chose resistance. The process of Romanization in Algeria was gradual and incomplete. The Romans built magnificent cities, Timgad, with its perfect grid of streets and stunning ruins that survive today, Jamila, perched dramatically on a mountain spur, and Tipasa, where Roman ruins overlook the Mediterranean in timeless splendor. These cities attracted Berber elites who adopted Roman customs, Latin language, and Roman law, creating a Romanized African aristocracy that would play crucial roles in the later Roman Empire. Yet beyond these urban centers, traditional Berber life continued much as it had for centuries. The Romans never fully controlled the high plateaus or the Saharan regions, and even in areas under nominal Roman authority, local customs persisted. Berber languages continued to be spoken, traditional agricultural practices maintained, and local religious beliefs adapted rather than abandoned. The relationship between Romans and Berbers produced remarkable figures who embodied this cultural synthesis. Saint Augustine, born in the Algerian town of Soucarras in 354 CE, became one of Christianity's most influential theologians. His mother, Saint Monica, was likely of Berber origin, and Augustine's writings reflect both his classical Roman education and his deep connection to North African spiritual traditions. His Confessions and City of God would shape Christian thought for centuries, representing the intellectual flowering that emerged from the meeting of Roman and African cultures. Christianity spread rapidly through Roman Algeria, often carried by Berber converts who adapted the new faith to local traditions and concerns. The Donatist movement, which emphasized the purity of the church and resisted imperial interference in religious matters, found particular support among Berber Christians who saw parallels between their desire for religious independence and their long tradition of political autonomy. The theological debates that raged across Algeria during the late Roman period reflected deeper questions about authority, identity, and the relationship between local and imperial power. As Roman power declined in the 5th century CE, Algeria became a battleground for competing forces. The Vandals, Germanic peoples who had carved out a kingdom in North Africa, controlled the coast from 429 to 534 CE, while much of the interior remained under Berber rule. The Vandal period, though relatively brief, left its mark on Algeria's cultural development, introducing new artistic influences and reinforcing the pattern of coastal foreign control combined with interior independence. The Byzantine reconquest of 534 CE brought Algeria back into the orbit of the Eastern Roman Empire, but Byzantine control was even more limited than Roman rule had been. The Byzantines held fortified cities and key ports, but the vast interior remained under the authority of Berber confederations that had grown stronger during the centuries of imperial weakness. This decentralized political landscape would profoundly influence how Algeria would respond to the next great wave of change, the arrival of Islamic armies in the late 7th century. When Arab forces first crossed from Egypt into Algeria around 670 CE, they encountered not a unified opposition but a patchwork of Berber kingdoms, Byzantine cities, and independent tribal confederations, each responding differently to the new challenge. Some Berber leaders, recognizing the weakness of Byzantine rule and the strength of the Arab advance, negotiated treaties and alliances. Others, particularly in the mountain strongholds, chose fierce resistance. The process of Islamic conquest in Algeria was not a single military campaign, but a series of complex negotiations, battles, and accommodations that stretched over several decades. Unlike the Arab conquest of Egypt or Syria, where established empires could be defeated in decisive battles, Algeria's decentralized structure meant that each region, each tribe, each city required separate negotiation or conquest. The remarkable figure of Kusayla, a Berber chief who initially converted to Islam and served as a Byzantine and later Arab ally, embodied the complex choices facing Algeria's peoples during this transition period. When he later rebelled against Arab rule and briefly controlled much of central Algeria, he represented the tension between Islamic conversion and political independence that would characterize Berber responses to Arab rule for generations. Even more dramatic was the story of Kahina, the Berber priestess queen who led a confederation of tribes in a final, desperate resistance against Arab expansion around 690 CE. Her story, whether historically accurate or mythologized by later chroniclers, captures something essential about the spirit of independence that has characterized Algerian peoples throughout their history. Her defeat marked the end of organized Berber resistance to Islamic rule, but not the end of Berber distinctiveness within the emerging Islamic civilization. By 711 CE, when Berber converts to Islam helped Umayyad forces complete the conquest of North Africa, Algeria had become part of a new world order that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. Yet the manner of this integration, through alliance and conversion, rather than mere conquest, ensured that Berber traditions and identities would continue to shape the development of Islamic civilization in North Africa. The Umayyad period saw the establishment of Arabic as the language of administration and religion, but not the displacement of Berber languages in daily life. Islamic law became the legal framework for society, but was often interpreted through traditional Berber concepts of justice and community decision-making. The new religion brought literacy in Arabic script, connecting Algeria to the broader Islamic world of scholarship and trade, while traditional Berber oral traditions continued to preserve local history and wisdom. As the first millennium of the Common Era drew to a close, Algeria had emerged as a distinctive part of the Islamic world, a land where Arab and Berber cultures had blended to create something new, where the geography of mountain and desert continued to shape human choices, and where the strategic position between Africa and Europe ensured continued significance in the broader currents of world history. The foundations had been laid for the medieval flowering that would follow, when Algeria would become home to sophisticated dynasties, brilliant scholars, and trading networks that connected Europe, Africa, and Asia. But that story of medieval glory and complexity awaits our next chapter in this long journey through Algerian time and space. Chapter 3: The Golden Thread. Imagine walking through the ruins of Tahert in the 10th century, when this city in the hills southwest of modern Algiers served as the capital of one of medieval Islam's most remarkable experiments in governance. Here, the Rustumid imams had created a state that embodied the Islamic principle of justice while honoring Berber traditions of consultation and community decision-making. The court of Tahert was renowned throughout the Islamic world for its scholars, its libraries, and its reputation for honest administration, a beacon of learning that attracted students from across North Africa and beyond. The Rustumid dynasty, which ruled from 761 to 909 CE, emerged from the complex religious and political currents that followed the Islamic conquest of Algeria. Founded by Abd al-Rahman ibn Rustum, a Persian scholar who had embraced the Ibadi branch of Islam, the Rustumid state represented something new in Islamic governance. The Ibadi faith, with its emphasis on religious purity and democratic principles, found natural resonance among Berber peoples who had long traditions of tribal consultation and egalitarian leadership. Under Rustumid rule, central Algeria became a haven for religious minorities and intellectual inquiry. The imams who governed Tahert were not hereditary rulers in the traditional sense, but religious leaders chosen for their learning and piety. They established a system of governance that balanced Islamic law with Berber customs, creating councils where tribal leaders could voice concerns and participate in decision-making. This synthesis of Islamic principles with indigenous African traditions produced a unique form of medieval democracy that would influence North African political thought for centuries. The prosperity of Tahert rested on its position astride the trans-Saharan trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the gold and salt mines of West Africa. Caravans laden with gold from Bambouk and Bure, salt from the great deposits at Tagaza, and slaves from the Sudan kingdoms converged on Tahert before continuing northward to the ports of the Mediterranean. The Rustumid rulers developed sophisticated systems for taxing and protecting this trade, while their reputation for honesty attracted merchants who preferred Tahert's markets to those of more corrupt or unstable regions. Yet the Rustumids' very success contained the seeds of their downfall. Their wealth attracted the attention of more powerful neighbors, while their democratic principles made it difficult to maintain the centralized military force necessary for defense against determined enemies. When the Fatimid dynasty, claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima, launched their westward expansion from their base in Tunisia, the Rustumid state proved unable to mount an effective resistance. The Fatimid conquest of Tahat in 909 CE marked the end of this early experiment in Islamic democracy, but also the beginning of Algeria's integration into one of the medieval world's most ambitious projects. The Fatimids aimed to create a universal Islamic empire that would stretch from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, with their capital eventually established at Cairo. For Algeria, Fatimid rule meant inclusion in a vast commercial and intellectual network that connected North Africa to the broader currents of Islamic civilization. Under Fatimid authority, Algerian ports like Bougie, modern Béjaïa, and Algiers began their transformation into major Mediterranean trading centers. These cities became cosmopolitan crossroads, where Berber merchants met Egyptian scholars, where Andalusian refugees mingled with pilgrims heading east to Mecca, where the mathematical innovations of Baghdad encountered the astronomical knowledge of Cordoba. The intellectual flowering that resulted from these encounters produced scholars, scientists, and poets whose works enriched Islamic civilization throughout the medieval period. The Zirid dynasty, which governed Algeria as Fatimid vassals from the mid-10th century, presided over this cultural renaissance. The Zirids, themselves of Berber origin, proved skilled at balancing the competing demands of local autonomy and imperial loyalty. They encouraged trade, supported scholarship, and maintained the delicate religious balance that allowed Sunni, Shia, and Ibadi communities to coexist within their territories. However, when the Zirids declared their independence from Fatimid rule in 1048 and switched their allegiance to the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad, they triggered one of the most consequential events in Algerian history. The Fatimid response was swift and devastating. They encouraged the Banu Hilal and Banu Sulaim, Arab Bedouin tribes from Upper Egypt, to migrate westward and make themselves masters of Zirid territories. The arrival of these Arab nomadic tribes in the mid-11th century transformed Algeria's demographic and cultural landscape. Unlike the earlier Arab conquerors who had been primarily soldiers and administrators, the Hilalian migration brought entire tribal societies, men, women, children, and vast herds of animals. These nomadic peoples, accustomed to the pastoral lifestyle of the Arabian Peninsula, found in Algeria's high plateaus an environment well suited to their traditional way of life. The impact of this migration was profound and lasting. The newcomers brought with them not just their flocks and their tribal structures, but also their language and cultural practices that would significantly influence the development of Algerian society. Arabic began to spread beyond the circles of scholars and administrators, becoming the daily language of an increasing portion of the population. Nomadic values and pastoral customs influenced settled communities, while the political fragmentation that accompanied the tribal migrations weakened centralized authority. From this apparent chaos emerged new forms of political organization adapted to Algeria's geographic realities. The Almoravid movement, originating among the Berber tribes of the Western Sahara in the 11th century, represented a religious revival that sought to purify Islamic practice while uniting the diverse peoples of North Africa under common religious principles. When Almoravid forces swept northward through Morocco and into Algeria, they brought with them an austere form of Islam that emphasized personal piety and social justice. The Almoravid period in Algeria was relatively brief, lasting only until the rise of their successors, the Almohads, in the 12th century. but their influence was lasting, particularly in promoting religious scholarship and in establishing institutions of Islamic learning that would endure long after their political power had faded. The madrasas they founded, the legal principles they established, and the architectural styles they introduced became part of Algeria's permanent cultural inheritance. The Almohad dynasty, which succeeded the Almoravids, represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt to create a unified North African state. Founded by Ibn Tumart, a Berber religious reformer from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, the Almohad movement combined Islamic orthodoxy with Berber traditions of leadership and consultation. Under rulers like Abd al-Mumin and his successors, the Almohads created an empire that stretched from Spain to Tripoli, with Algeria serving as a crucial link between the movement's Moroccan heartland and its eastern territories. During the Almohad period, Algerian cities experienced remarkable growth and prosperity. Tlemcen, strategically positioned near the Moroccan border, became a major center of learning and commerce. Its great mosque, built during this period, exemplified the architectural synthesis that characterized Almohad civilization, combining traditional Berber geometric patterns with innovations borrowed from Andalusian and Eastern Islamic traditions. The city's madrasas attracted students from across the Islamic world, while its markets served as distribution centers for goods traveling between Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Almohad emphasis on religious unity and administrative efficiency helped create the conditions for cultural flowering, but it also generated tensions that would ultimately undermine their empire. Their attempts to impose doctrinal uniformity conflicted with the diversity of religious traditions that had developed in different regions of their vast territories. Berber groups that had embraced Islam while maintaining their own customs found themselves under pressure to conform to more rigid interpretations of religious law. The gradual decline of Almohad power in the 13th century created opportunities for local dynasties to assert independence. In eastern Algeria, the Hafsid dynasty established control from their base in Tunisia, while in the west, the Marinids extended their influence from Morocco. Central Algeria saw the rise of the Abd al-Wadids, a Berber dynasty that made Tlemcen their capital and created one of the medieval period's most sophisticated regional states. The Abd al-Wadid kingdom of Tlemcen, lasting from 1235 to 1554, represented the culmination of medieval Algerian Islamic civilization. Under rulers like Yagmurasen ibn Zayan and his successors, Tlemcen became renowned for its scholars, craftsmen, and merchants. The city's textile industry produced silks and woolens that were prized throughout the Mediterranean, while its scholars made important contributions to astronomy, mathematics, and Islamic jurisprudence. The Ibn Khaldun family, which would produce one of history's greatest historians and social theorists, found refuge in Tlemcen during the political upheavals of the 14th century. Ibn Khaldun's experiences in Algeria, observing the rise and fall of dynasties and the interaction between nomadic and settled peoples, would profoundly influence his revolutionary approach to understanding historical change and social development. Yet even as these medieval dynasties created sophisticated urban civilizations, the fundamental geographic and cultural patterns established in earlier periods persisted. The Saharan regions remained largely autonomous, governed by Tuareg confederations that maintained their own traditions while participating in the broader Islamic world through trade and pilgrimage. The mountain regions of Kabylie preserved their distinctive Berber cultures, accepting Islamic religion while maintaining their own languages and customs. As the medieval period drew to a close, Algeria had become a complex mosaic of overlapping identities and influences. Islamic civilization provided a unifying framework of law, learning, and spiritual practice, while Berber traditions continued to shape local governance and social organization. Arabic had become the language of scholarship and administration, but Berber languages remained vital in daily life. The cities looked outward to the broader Islamic world, while the countryside maintained rhythms and customs rooted in local landscapes and ancient traditions. This rich medieval heritage would provide the foundation for Algeria's response to the new challenges that awaited the rise of Ottoman power, the expansion of European influence, and eventually the colonial encounter that would reshape North African civilization. But the patterns established during these golden centuries, the ability to adapt foreign influences while preserving core cultural values, the tension between unity and diversity, the geographic divisions that created distinct regional cultures, would continue to define the Algerian experience through all the transformations that lay ahead. Chapter 4: Between Empire and Independence. In the early morning mist that often shrouds Algiers harbour, you might imagine the sight that greeted European merchants in the 16th century. The distinctive silhouettes of Ottoman galleys alongside the sleek vessels of the Barbary corsairs, their masts rising like a forest against the whitewashed walls of the Kasbah. This was Algeria during its Ottoman centuries, a time when this North African land became both a formidable naval power in the Mediterranean and a largely autonomous province of the world's most powerful empire. The Ottoman integration of Algeria was unlike the earlier conquests that had swept across this land. When the brothers Arouj and Hizir Barbarossa arrived in the early 16th century, they came not as representatives of the Ottoman Sultan, but as corsair captains seeking bases for their operations against Christian shipping. Their transformation from independent sea raiders into Ottoman governors illustrates the pragmatic flexibility that characterized Ottoman rule in North Africa. Arouj Barbarossa first established himself in Algiers around 1516, invited by local leaders who needed military assistance against Spanish attacks on the coast. His death in 1518, while fighting Spanish forces near Tlemcen, might have ended this chapter of Algerian history. Instead, his brother Hizir, later known as Hayreddin Barbarossa, made the crucial decision to seek Ottoman protection and legitimacy. In 1519, he formally acknowledged Ottoman sovereignty and was appointed as the first Ottoman governor of Algeria. This arrangement suited both parties perfectly. The Ottomans gained a naval base in the western Mediterranean without the expense of conquest, while the corsairs of Algiers received the protection of the empire's vast resources and the legitimacy of imperial authority. Under this system, Algeria would enjoy remarkable autonomy while remaining formally part of the Ottoman Empire for over 3 centuries, until the French conquest of 1830. The society that emerged under Ottoman rule was fascinatingly complex, shaped by the intersection of imperial authority, corsair culture, Berber traditions, and the realities of Mediterranean commerce and conflict. At its apex stood the Dey, the Ottoman governor who ruled from the Kasbah overlooking Algiers harbour. Below him, a sophisticated administrative system balanced the needs of different communities and regions, while accommodating the geographic divisions that had always characterized this land. The famous Janissaries, elite Ottoman soldiers originally recruited from Christian populations in the Balkans, formed the backbone of military power in Ottoman Algeria. These professional warriors, trained in the latest military techniques and fiercely loyal to the Ottoman system, provided the stability that allowed Algerian society to flourish. Yet over time, many Janissaries married local women, adopted local customs, and became as much Algerian as Ottoman, representing another layer in the ongoing cultural synthesis that defined this land. The corsair fleet that operated from Algerian ports was perhaps the most distinctive feature of Ottoman Algeria. These vessels, ranging from small, fast galleots to larger sailing ships capable of long voyages, made Algiers one of the most feared and respected naval powers in the Mediterranean. The corsairs were not mere pirates, but participants in a complex system of naval warfare, diplomacy, and commerce that connected Algeria to the broader currents of European and Ottoman politics. European fears of the Barbary corsairs often overshadowed the sophisticated civilization that supported their operations. The corsair fleet required not just skilled sailors and captains, but also shipbuilders, navigators, financiers, and diplomats. Algiers developed industries to support naval operations, foundries that cast cannons, workshops that produced the finest maritime equipment, and trading houses that managed the complex international negotiations that governed corsair activities. The wealth generated by corsair operations and trans-Saharan trade supported a remarkable cultural flowering in Ottoman Algeria. The Ketchaoua Mosque in Algiers, with its distinctive Ottoman architectural elements adapted to North African traditions, exemplified the artistic synthesis that emerged during this period. The palaces of the Deys, the elaborate hammams that served as social centers, and the covered markets, where goods from 3 continents changed hands, all reflected the cosmopolitan sophistication of Ottoman Algerian civilization. Religious life under Ottoman rule showcased the complex accommodations that characterized this period. While Islam provided the overarching framework for society, the Ottomans generally respected local religious traditions and practices. Sufi brotherhoods, which had deep roots in Berber spiritual traditions, flourished under Ottoman protection. The Qadiriyya, Tijaniyya, and other mystical orders established zawiyas, religious centers, throughout Algeria, serving not only as places of worship and spiritual instruction, but also as schools, hostels for travelers, and centers of economic activity. The marabout tradition, which venerated local holy men and women believed to possess special spiritual powers, continued to thrive alongside more orthodox Islamic practices. These local saints, often descended from prominent families or associated with particular tribes or regions, served as intermediaries between Ottoman authority and local communities. Their tombs became pilgrimage sites. Their descendants often inherited both spiritual authority and political influence, and their traditions helped maintain connections between Islamic orthodoxy and pre-Islamic African spiritual practices. In the vast interior regions, Ottoman authority remained largely theoretical. The Saharan peoples, Tuareg confederations, Arab tribes, and scattered oasis communities maintained their traditional patterns of life while acknowledging Ottoman sovereignty in name. The salt mines of the Sahara, the date palm oases, and the caravan routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean remained under local control, governed by ancient customs and traditional leaders who had little direct contact with Ottoman administrators. The high plateaus presented a different challenge for Ottoman governance. Here, a complex mixture of Arab tribes, many descended from the Hilalian migrants of the 11th century, and Berber communities created a patchwork of competing authorities. Ottoman policy in these regions relied heavily on playing different groups against each other, supporting now one chief, now another, in an endless series of negotiations and minor conflicts that maintained a rough balance of power while preventing any single leader from becoming too powerful. This system of indirect rule, though it maintained peace for long periods, also contributed to the political fragmentation that would make Algeria vulnerable to European expansion in later centuries. The Ottomans never developed the institutional structures necessary to truly unify Algeria's diverse regions, preferring instead the flexibility of personal relationships and temporary alliances that could be adjusted as circumstances changed. The 18th century brought new challenges to Ottoman Algeria as European naval power grew and the traditional sources of Corsair wealth began to decline. The rise of stronger European navies made Corsair operations more dangerous and less profitable, while the development of alternative trade routes reduced the importance of trans-Saharan commerce. European powers, particularly France, began to view the North African coast not as an equal trading partner, but as a potential target for expansion and colonization. Yet even as external pressures mounted, Algeria continued to demonstrate remarkable cultural vitality. The poetry of Ahmad al-Wanshirisi, the historical chronicles of al-Makrizi's successors, and the architectural achievements of late Ottoman Algeria all testified to a civilization that remained confident and creative despite growing political challenges. The scholarly traditions established in medieval times continued to flourish, with madrasas in Tlemcen, Constantine, and Algiers producing graduates who contributed to Islamic learning throughout the Ottoman world. The traditional crafts that had made Algerian cities famous throughout the Mediterranean, the intricate carpets of Kairouan influence, the delicate jewelry work that incorporated Berber geometric patterns with Ottoman styles, the leather goods that combined local materials with international techniques continued to find markets across Europe and the Islamic world. These industries supported urban communities that had developed their own distinctive cultures, blending Ottoman urban customs with local North African traditions. As the 18th century progressed, however, signs of strain became increasingly apparent. The decline in Corsair revenues forced the Deys to rely more heavily on taxation of agricultural communities and pastoral tribes, creating tensions that had previously been mitigated by external wealth. European diplomatic pressure, backed by increasingly powerful navies, made it more difficult to maintain the delicate balance between accommodation and independence that had characterized Ottoman Algerian foreign policy. The French occupation of Egypt in 1798, though brief, demonstrated European willingness to challenge Ottoman authority directly in Muslim lands. The subsequent growth of French commercial interests in the Mediterranean, combined with domestic political pressures in France for overseas expansion, created the conditions that would lead to the French invasion of Algeria in 1830. Yet at the end of the Ottoman period, Algeria remained a distinctive civilization that had successfully adapted to 3 centuries of imperial rule while maintaining its essential character. The synthesis of Ottoman administration, Corsair maritime culture, Berber traditions, and Arab influences had created something unique in the Islamic world, a society that was simultaneously local and cosmopolitan, traditional and innovative, African and Mediterranean. The institutional foundations laid during the Ottoman period, the legal traditions, the educational systems, the commercial networks, and the religious institutions would provide the framework within which Algerians would resist French colonization and eventually forge their modern national identity. The experience of Ottoman rule had taught valuable lessons about maintaining cultural autonomy within imperial systems, lessons that would prove crucial during the long struggle for independence that lay ahead. The morning mist that shrouded Algiers harbour had witnessed the rise and decline of Corsair power, the flowering of Ottoman Algerian civilization, and the growing pressures that would soon transform this ancient land once again. As the 19th century dawned, Algeria stood at another historical crossroads, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom and traditions of its complex past into an uncertain but still unwritten future. Chapter 5: The Colonial Transformation. On July 5, 1830, French forces landed on the beaches near Algiers, beginning what would become one of the longest and most transformative colonial occupations in modern history. The immediate pretext for invasion was a diplomatic incident. The Dey of Algiers had struck the French consul with a fly whisk during a heated argument about unpaid debts, but the underlying causes ran much deeper. France, still seeking to restore its prestige after the Napoleonic defeats, saw in Algeria an opportunity to rebuild its empire and demonstrate its renewed power to European rivals. The speed of the initial conquest surprised even the French commanders. Within 3 weeks, Algiers had fallen, the Dey had fled into exile, and the Ottoman flag no longer flew over the Kasbah. Yet this rapid military success masked the enormous challenges that lay ahead. Conquering the capital was one thing. Controlling a territory larger than France itself, inhabited by diverse peoples with their own traditions of independence, would prove to be an entirely different proposition. The early years of French rule were marked by confusion and contradictory policies. Some French officials imagined they could simply replace Ottoman authority with French administration, governing through existing institutions and local leaders. Others advocated for complete transformation, the replacement of Islamic law with French legal codes, and the settlement of European colonists throughout the territory. These competing visions would create decades of policy reversals and half measures that often achieved the worst of both approaches. The most formidable challenge to French rule emerged from an unexpected quarter. Abdelkader ibn Muhyiddin, the son of a respected religious teacher from the region near Mascara, was only 24 years old when he was proclaimed emir by a confederation of Arab and Berber tribes in 1832. Young, educated in both Islamic law and military strategy, Abdelkader would transform what might have been a series of disconnected tribal rebellions into a coherent movement of national resistance. The state that Abdelkader created in the interior of Algeria between 1832 and 1847 represented one of the most remarkable experiments in state-building under colonial pressure. Working from mobile capitals that could be relocated as military necessity demanded, he established an administrative system that combined Islamic law with pragmatic adaptations to the requirements of modern warfare. His letters to tribal chiefs, preserved in French archives, reveal a sophisticated understanding of both traditional authority and the new challenges posed by European military technology. Abdelkader's forces employed guerrilla tactics that exploited Algeria's geographic advantages, the mountain hideouts, the vast plateaus where conventional armies could be avoided, and the desert regions where water knowledge meant the difference between life and death. His cavalry, trained in the traditional Berber and Arab styles of mobile warfare, proved devastatingly effective against French columns accustomed to European battlefields. For 15 years, his resistance movement controlled much of Algeria's interior, collecting taxes, administering justice, and maintaining diplomatic relations with neighboring powers. The emir's approach to governance reflected the deep cultural currents that had shaped Algeria for centuries. He drew his authority not only from military success, but from his reputation as a religious scholar and his ability to unite the diverse tribal confederations of the interior. His court attracted poets, legal scholars, and administrators who saw in his movement a chance to preserve Islamic civilization against European encroachment. French strategy evolved slowly and painfully through trial and error. The appointment of General Thomas Bugeaud as Governor-General in 1840 marked a turning point toward more systematic and ruthless methods. Bigot understood that defeating Abd el-Qadir required not just military victories, but the destruction of the economic and social foundations that supported his movement. The French began implementing a policy of total war that targeted civilian populations, destroyed crops and livestock, and sought to make the cost of resistance unbearable for ordinary Algerians. The infamous enfumades and razzias of this period, the smoking out of cave refuges, and the systematic destruction of villages represented a dark chapter in colonial history that left deep scars on Algerian collective memory. These tactics, while militarily effective, created cycles of hatred and resistance that would influence Algerian-French relations for generations to come. Abd el-Qadir's eventual surrender in 1847 marked the end of organized military resistance to French rule, but not the end of Algerian resistance itself. The emir's exile to Damascus, where he lived out his days as a scholar and mystic, became itself a symbol of the intellectual and spiritual traditions that colonialism could not entirely destroy. His writings during his Syrian exile, particularly his mystical poetry and his philosophical meditations on the nature of divine justice, influenced Islamic thought far beyond Algeria's borders. With military resistance defeated, France began the systematic transformation of Algerian society through settler colonialism on an unprecedented scale. Unlike other colonial territories where European presence remained limited to administrators and merchants, Algeria was designated for complete demographic transformation. The goal was not merely to exploit Algeria's resources, but to create a new France in North Africa, where European settlers would become the majority population. The Warnier Law of 1873 and subsequent legislation broke up traditional collective land holdings and forced individual land registration according to French legal principles. This seemingly technical administrative change had revolutionary social consequences. Tribal communities that had held land collectively for centuries found their territories divided and often lost to European settlers who better understood the new legal system. The destruction of traditional land tenure undermined the economic foundations of tribal society and created a displaced rural population that would provide labor for colonial enterprises. French educational policy sought to reshape Algerian consciousness by promoting French language and culture while marginalizing Arabic and Berber traditions. The colonial administration established French schools in major cities and towns, offering education that could lead to positions in the colonial bureaucracy, but only for those willing to abandon their linguistic and cultural heritage. Traditional Islamic education, centered on Quranic schools and madrasas, was actively discouraged and sometimes suppressed. Yet despite these pressures, Algerian society demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. In the mountains of Kabylie, Berber communities maintained their languages and customs while selectively adopting useful French innovations. In the desert regions, Tuareg societies continued their traditional patterns of life largely unchanged, too remote and mobile for effective colonial control. In the cities, a new class of Algerian intellectuals emerged who had mastered French education while maintaining connections to their Islamic and Berber heritage. The religious response to colonial rule took many forms, from the quiet persistence of traditional practices to the emergence of new reform movements that sought to revitalize Islamic civilization. The Salafi movement, influenced by reformers like Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, found adherents among Algerian scholars who argued that Muslims could preserve their faith while adopting beneficial aspects of modern European civilization. These reformers established schools, published newspapers, and created cultural associations that helped maintain Algerian identity during the darkest periods of colonial rule. The Sufi brotherhoods, deeply rooted in Algerian spiritual traditions, adapted to colonial conditions by emphasizing their social and educational functions. The Qadiriyya, Rahmaniyya, and other orders maintained networks that crossed tribal and regional boundaries, providing alternative sources of authority and community organization that the colonial administration could never fully control or understand. Economic transformation under French rule was dramatic and often traumatic. The introduction of modern transportation railways connecting the coast to interior cities, roads that facilitated commercial agriculture and administrative control, integrated Algeria into global markets in unprecedented ways. The fertile plains of the Tell were increasingly devoted to crops for export to France: wheat, barley, oats, and later citrus fruits and wine grapes that transformed the landscape and the economy. This agricultural transformation displaced many traditional pastoralists and subsistence farmers, creating a growing class of landless rural workers who migrated to cities in search of employment. Algiers, Constantine, and Oran grew rapidly during the colonial period, becoming ethnically mixed cities where European settlers assimilated Algerians, and recent migrants from the countryside created new forms of urban culture. The discovery of natural gas and oil in the Sahara during the 1950s added another dimension to Algeria's colonial experience. These vast energy resources, found beneath the seemingly empty desert, suddenly made Algeria's interior regions strategically valuable in ways that earlier generations could never have imagined. The wealth generated by these discoveries would later help finance the independence struggle and provide the economic foundation for the post-independence state. World War II brought new complications and opportunities to colonial Algeria. The Allied invasion of North Africa in 1942 made Algeria a crucial base for operations against Nazi Germany, while exposing Algerian soldiers and intellectuals to new ideas about democracy, self-determination, and human rights. Algerians who fought alongside French and American forces in the liberation of Europe began to question why these same principles of freedom could not apply to their own homeland. The Sétif massacres of May 1945, when French forces killed thousands of Algerians during demonstrations celebrating the Allied victory in Europe, marked a crucial turning point in Algerian consciousness. The brutal suppression of what had begun as peaceful celebrations of victory over fascism revealed the contradictions at the heart of French colonial ideology, and convinced many Algerians that independence could only be achieved through force. The intellectual foundations for the independence struggle had been laid during the preceding decades by reformers, traditionalists, and modernists who, despite their differences, shared a common commitment to Algerian dignity and self-determination. The Association of Algerian Muslim Ulama, founded in 1931, had worked to preserve Arabic language and Islamic culture, while political organizations like the Étoile Nord-Africaine had articulated demands for equality and eventually independence. By 1954, when the Front de Libération Nationale, FLN, launched the armed struggle for independence, Algeria was a society that had been profoundly transformed by more than a century of colonial rule, yet had never been entirely conquered. The geographic patterns that had shaped Algerian history for millennia, the coastal interior divide, the mountain strongholds, the desert autonomy, would once again influence the course of political change. The mountains that had sheltered Abd el-Kader would provide bases for FLN guerrillas. The Sahara that had remained largely outside colonial control would become a sanctuary for independence fighters. The cities that had been centers of colonial administration would become battlegrounds for the hearts and minds of a people determined to reclaim their homeland. The colonial period had created new forms of Algerian identity while failing to destroy older ones. French education had produced a generation of Algerian intellectuals who could articulate independence demands in terms that the international community would understand, while traditional religious and tribal leaders provided the moral authority and social networks necessary for sustained resistance. The stage was set for one of the 20th century's most significant decolonization struggles, a conflict that would reshape not only Algeria, but also France and the broader understanding of colonial relationships in the modern world. Chapter 6: The Struggle for Identity. November 1954 arrived like any other autumn day in the Oases mountains of eastern Algeria, but by nightfall, coordinated attacks across the country had announced the beginning of what would become one of the 20th century's most significant wars of decolonization. The Front de Libération Nationale had chosen All Saints' Day deliberately, understanding that the symbolism of this Catholic holiday would underscore their challenge to French authority. In the remote valleys where Berber communities had maintained their independence through centuries of foreign rule, the first shots of the Algerian Revolution echoed off ancient mountain walls that had witnessed countless struggles for freedom. The war that followed would last 8 brutal years, cost over 1 million lives, and ultimately transform not only Algeria but France itself. It was a conflict that defied easy categorization: part guerrilla war, part civil war, part international crisis, that drew in the superpowers and influenced decolonization movements worldwide. The FLN's strategy was both sophisticated and simple: make the cost of maintaining French rule higher than the cost of granting independence. The geographic advantages that had served Abd el-Qaeda a century earlier proved equally valuable to the FLN. The mountains provided bases that were nearly impossible for conventional forces to clear permanently. The Sahara offered vast spaces where guerrilla units could train, reorganize, and launch surprise attacks. The proximity to independent Tunisia and Morocco provided sanctuaries and supply routes that kept the independence movement alive even during its darkest periods. French responses to the rebellion revealed both the determination and the contradictions of late colonial rule. General Jacques Massou's paratroopers, veterans of conflicts in Indochina, employed methods learned in counterinsurgency campaigns across the empire. The Battle of Algiers, fought in the narrow streets of the Kasbah between 1956 and 1957, became emblematic of the moral complexities of decolonization warfare. French forces successfully broke the FLN's urban network through systematic torture and mass arrests, but the methods employed undermined French claims to represent civilization and democracy in North Africa. The war created profound divisions within both Algerian and French society. Among Algerians, the conflict between the FLN and rival nationalist movements like Messali Hadji's Mouvement National Algérien sometimes erupted into violent confrontations that weakened the independence cause. Among French settlers who had come to see Algeria as their permanent homeland, the prospect of independence threatened not just their property but their entire way of life. The organization Armée Secrète, OAS, formed by French extremists determined to prevent Algerian independence, launched terrorist campaigns against both Muslim civilians and French officials who supported negotiations. The international dimensions of the Algerian War extended far beyond the Mediterranean. In the United Nations, Newly independent African and Asian nations rallied to support Algerian independence, transforming a colonial conflict into a symbol of the broader struggle against European imperialism. The Soviet Union and China provided weapons and training to FLN forces, while the United States found itself torn between support for its NATO ally France and its professed commitment to self-determination. General Charles de Gaulle's return to power in France in 1958, initially welcomed by French settlers who believed he would pursue the war more vigorously, ultimately led to recognition that Algeria could not be held by force indefinitely. De Gaulle's famous declaration that Algeria would achieve self-determination marked the beginning of the end for French colonial rule, though the road to independence would still require 4 more years of negotiations, continued fighting, and terrorist campaigns by both the OAS and the FLN. The Evian Accords, signed in March 1962, formally ended the war and established the framework for Algerian independence. Yet Independence Day, July 5, 1962, was marked not by universal celebration but by massive population movements that would reshape Algeria's demographic composition. Nearly 1 million French settlers, known as Pieds Noirs, fled to France within months of independence, along with tens of thousands of Algerians who had collaborated with colonial rule. This exodus left Algeria suddenly deprived of much of its educated population, skilled workers, and administrative expertise. The early years of independence presented challenges that few had fully anticipated during the struggle against colonial rule. Ahmed Ben Bella, Algeria's first president, inherited a country devastated by 8 years of war, economically dependent on France, and politically divided among competing visions of what independent Algeria should become. The FLN, which had united diverse groups in opposition to French rule, now had to transform itself from a liberation movement into a governing party capable of addressing the mundane but crucial tasks of running a modern state. The geographic challenges that had shaped Algeria throughout its history took on new dimensions in the independence period. The Sahara, which had been largely peripheral during the colonial era except as a source of oil and gas revenues, suddenly became central to Algeria's economic prospects. The hydrocarbon resources discovered beneath the desert sands provided the new state with the financial means to pursue ambitious development programs, but also created a dangerous dependence on volatile international energy markets. Ben Bella's government attempted to address Algeria's challenges through a combination of Arab socialism and non-aligned foreign policy. Land reform programs redistributed former colonial estates to agricultural cooperatives, while industrial development projects aimed to reduce dependence on imported goods. The nationalization of foreign-owned businesses and the establishment of state-controlled industries reflected ideological commitments to socialist economic principles, but also practical recognition that private capital was unlikely to invest heavily in post-war Algeria. The coup that brought Houari Boumediene to power in 1965 marked a shift toward more pragmatic and technocratic approaches to development. Boumediene, a former military leader in the independence struggle, emphasized economic modernization and the efficient exploitation of hydrocarbon resources to finance ambitious industrialization programs. Under his leadership, Algeria became a leader in the non-aligned movement and a vocal advocate for Third World economic rights in international forums. The Boumediene era, lasting until his death in 1978, saw significant achievements in education, healthcare, and industrial development. Free education through university level created opportunities for rural populations that had been excluded from advancement during the colonial period. Arabic became the official language of instruction, reversing colonial policies that had marginalized indigenous languages. New universities in Constantine, Oran, and other cities produced doctors, engineers, and teachers who would staff the expanding public sector. Yet these successes came at considerable cost. The emphasis on heavy industry and import substitution created inefficient state enterprises that required constant subsidies. The rapid expansion of education in Arabic, while psychologically important for national identity, often failed to provide students with the practical skills needed in a modern economy. The centralized planning that characterized Boumediene's economic policies, while achieving impressive growth rates during the oil boom of the 1970s, created rigidities that would prove problematic when global energy prices declined. The geographic and cultural divisions that had characterized Algeria throughout its history persisted and sometimes intensified during the early independence period. Government efforts to promote Arab identity and Arabic language encountered resistance in Berber regions, particularly Kabylie, where local populations insisted on maintaining their distinct cultural traditions. The 1980 Berber Spring demonstrations in Tizi Ouzou marked the emergence of an organized Amazigh cultural movement that would continue to influence Algerian politics for decades. The question of language became a particularly complex issue in post-independence Algeria. Colonial education had created an elite comfortable in French, while the independence struggle had emphasized Arabic as the language of authentic Algerian identity. Berber communities insisted on recognition of their own languages, while practical considerations often favored French in technical and commercial contexts. The resulting linguistic landscape reflected the broader challenges of nation-building in a society shaped by multiple cultural influences. Religious identity presented similar complexities. While Islam was established as the state religion and provided a unifying framework for national identity, the traditions of religious diversity and tolerance that had characterized pre-colonial Algeria had to be reconstructed in new forms. The role of Sufi brotherhoods, the place of traditional Islamic scholarship, and the influence of modern reformist movements all required careful negotiation as Algeria sought to define its spiritual as well as political independence. The economic crisis that began in the 1980s, triggered by declining oil prices and the inefficiencies of state-controlled industry, forced Algeria to confront fundamental questions about its development model. Structural adjustment programs demanded by international creditors required privatization of state enterprises and reduction of government subsidies that had provided stability for much of the population. These economic pressures created social tensions that would eventually contribute to the political crisis of the 1990s. The introduction of multi-party democracy in 1989 unleashed forces that had been building beneath the surface of single-party rule for decades. The Front Islamique du Salut, FIS, which emerged as the leading opposition party, articulated the frustrations of populations that felt excluded from the benefits of independence. Their electoral success in local elections and their likely victory in the planned national elections of 1992 prompted military intervention that cancelled the democratic process and initiated a decade of civil conflict. The civil war of the 1990s, which Algerians refer to simply as the Decade of Terror, represented the darkest period in the country's post-independence history. The conflict between government forces, Islamist guerrillas, and armed groups of uncertain allegiance cost perhaps 200,000 lives and displaced hundreds of thousands more. Villages were abandoned, Intellectuals fled into exile, and the social fabric that had held Algeria together seemed to be unraveling. Yet even during this terrible period, the underlying resilience of Algerian society became apparent. Local communities developed their own protection mechanisms. Traditional leaders and religious figures worked to mediate conflicts and protect civilians. The geographic diversity that had complicated central authority throughout Algeria's history now provided refuges where life could continue despite the violence. The gradual return to stability under President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who came to power in 1999, was based partly on national exhaustion with conflict, but also on renewed emphasis on the cultural and religious traditions that had sustained Algeria through previous crises. The Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation, approved by referendum in 2005, reflected a pragmatic recognition that Algeria's diverse society required accommodation rather than confrontation among its various components. Modern Algeria continues to navigate the tensions between its multiple identities and influences. The Hirak movement that began in 2019, bringing millions into the streets in peaceful protests against authoritarian rule, demonstrated both the persistence of democratic aspirations and the continuing influence of traditional Algerian values of consultation and consensus building. The protesters' insistence on non-violence, their respect for religious traditions, and their inclusion of Berber cultural symbols alongside Arabic and Islamic ones reflected the complex synthesis that defines contemporary Algerian identity. Today's Algeria remains shaped by all the layers of its complex history. In the cities, French colonial architecture stands alongside Ottoman mosques and modern apartment blocks. In the countryside, traditional agricultural practices coexist with industrial mining operations and petroleum facilities. In the Sahara, ancient caravan routes now parallel modern highways that carry the products of oil and gas fields to Mediterranean ports. The challenges facing contemporary Algeria, economic diversification, political reform, cultural accommodation, and environmental sustainability, echo themes that have resonated throughout the country's long history. How to balance unity with diversity, how to adapt to external pressures while maintaining cultural authenticity, how to exploit natural resources while protecting traditional ways of life. These questions have been constants in the Algerian experience, even as the specific forms they take continue to evolve. As we prepare to conclude our journey through Algerian history and geography, we carry with us an understanding of a land and people that have demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability across millennia of change. From the green Sahara of prehistoric times to the oil-rich nation of today, from the Berber kingdoms that resisted Roman conquest to the modern state that emerged from colonial rule, Algeria's story is one of survival, synthesis, and the eternal human quest for dignity and self-determination.